Welcome to the Athletic Skills Podcast, the show where we help sports coaches and PE teachers learn how they can impact their athletes' movement and physical development in a fun, practical way. I'm your host, Isaac, founder of Athletic Skills, and in today's episode, we are delighted to welcome Isaac Hopkins, an S&C coach specialising in youth athletic development, working within various sports and schools. Isaac shares experience in profiling and testing youth athletes and talks through his processes in creating a testing battery to best assess and analyse your athletes. Don't forget to subscribe, leave us a review if you enjoy the show. Now let's get started. This podcast is brought to you by Brendan Chaplin Business Coaching. Brendan guides coaches and service-based entrepreneurs to deliver their best work, build a seven-figure lifestyle and performance business, and create a life of freedom. I started working with Brendan in September 2023, and it's been a great journey since I started working with him in launching my own business, Athletic Skills. Brendan has been fully invested in me and is a great person to chat with, to share ideas, and has vast knowledge and experiences to share also. The reason I picked to work with Brendan is that he has done it himself in launching businesses and has a similar background to myself in S&C and wants to live a life that you want. If you want to speak to Brendan on how he can help create a life of freedom and guide you on that journey, get in touch with him by one of the methods in the show notes and DM him the word coach, and he will start the conversation. You won't regret it, and there's a good chance it might just change your life too. Hi everyone, welcome to the Athletic Skills Podcast. I'm delighted to have Isaac Hopkins on board with me. So Isaac, thank you very much for your time. I just want to share a little bit about your journey and what you've been up to and where you are now.
Hi, Isaac. So thank you firstly. So yes, I'm currently an S&C coach based predominantly in the youth population. So I'm an academy S&C coach at county level cricket. I'm an athletic development coach at a private school based in Devon. And I'm also the head of S&C at England Touch Rugby. And in addition to that, I also start my PhD in September in the youth paediatric performance realm, looking at talent identification from an elite cricket background.
A lot of different experiences, and it sounds like your plate is very much full at the moment.
It's a lot of organisation, right? But yeah, we're getting there. It's low tech.
I appreciate your time to come on board here. So today, I think we discussed prior, but want to chat a little bit more around testing batteries and how you go around profiling your youth athletes. So just want to share what sort of profiling you do at the moment, and then that step process in how you go about creating a testing battery.
Yeah, I think the first thing to consider is the paradigm in which you're currently based. As an example, at academy level cricket, it tends to be governed by the NGB, the national governing body, and in this case, the English Cricket Board. Cricket in particular seems to be quite sporadic. In other words, like counties do their own thing. So as an example, we tend to go off our feeder county, so the major county, and it allows lads at the minor county level to look at where they are based upon the major county level. And it also helps the major county to pick out any real talent that we've got coming through. So there's a synchronicity between there, whereas like school is a completely different kettle of fish. It tends to be more internal, and it tends to be based off the equipment that you have available to you as well.
If you're a sports coach or as an S&C coach, why would you want to profile your athletes, or what information would it give you? Why would you take time to profile your athletes?
I think testing in itself probably be split into quite a few categories. I think the first thing is like bridging the gap between the physical and technical side of stuff. A huge one, especially in the youth population, is education. Educating players on why we do what we do, how they can get better at it, translation onto pitch, to give us an insight into where those athletes are as well within their cohort, or also based whether it's at a step up in age category level. And it just allows us as coaches, both from the performance side, but also technical, tactical coaches, to inform the decisions around who might be ready, who may be a higher risk, who's your standout performer in this category. And it just allows us to make better judgment on that process overall, really.
And then would your testing battery change between different sports? So you do a few different sports in your coaching. Does your batteries for youth athletes, or some of it quite general? Does some of it transfer over to different sports?
Yeah, from a school perspective, it's very general. Again, it's looking at maybe what the national governing body might do. So as an example, like you look at cricket, you're looking at a 1200-meter run. If you're looking at netball, you're looking at court run. If you're looking at England hockey as an example, you might be looking at 16 pitch lengths. Rugby tends to be the Bronco. It's very much understanding that, because you don't want to run a test that might not have a huge amount of data within that cohort. But it's sporadic in that approach, that also if you have a wide enough sample pool, like a school as an example, having a generalized test for the whole school provides you with far more information. So if everyone did the same test, it means then you can benchmark, you can understand if they're exceptionally good at their age group, where do they sit in the higher age group if they're able to play up. It also understands if there's an element of growth and maturation. They at the same level as someone who might be the year above but slightly lower or less in their offset to maturity. I hope it's quite a it's quite an interesting topic. But where do you want to go? Do you link it to the NGB, or do you have your own internal process from a school perspective?
And which side do you you trying to go down, or is that always ever changing?
Yeah, no, absolutely, it is always ever changing. It depends what hat I sit with on. So from a school perspective, I like to be very general. I think it's really important for athletes from the first team under 18s, whether that's netball, hockey, rugby, cricket, to do it. And then it also allows those younger age groups to understand where they might sit within that first team squad. Under 14 athlete might only be a couple of maybe levels away, or they might be only a few centimeters off what the average might be for that first team. So having that general allows them to see the journey and the profile. And in turn, that can obviously create a lot of buy-in as well, because they can see their progress being made step by step. From a county perspective, depending on what the feeder county might want or what the national governing body might want, it is important that you work really closely with them and you have that constant direct communication.
So let's talk a little bit around that process of creating a testing battery. So let's go down the cricket side. You mentioned a bit around cricket, and I've got a bit of background in cricket as well. So let's say you got a group of cricketers. What sort of age groups are you working with at the moment? Then we can just...
I work from 12, 13 years old all the way up to 18. So real adolescent.
Yeah. Well, firstly, before we dive into the process, does your testing battery change between the age groups? So from that younger age group to the older ones?
Currently, no. There's probably more emphasis around the understanding of growth and maturation, maybe in the youngsters. Whereas as you get into the older age groups of maybe 17, 18 years old, there's probably less of an emphasis on there. That would be the only real difference. Even still, we do it for the older group as well. But no, the tests are the same all the way through, from 12, 13 all the way up to 18.
You mentioned one of your tests there was around growth and maturation. What are your other elements that you're looking to identify in your testing battery, or that you want to identify?
Yeah, I think the most important ones to look at would be the big three of strength, power, and speed. And then also understanding their potential of aerobic capacity. And then you can dive into different things like calf capacity, hamstring capacity, movement pattern quality as well, trunk capacity and stabilization. The list could probably go on, but I think the big three of strength, power, and speed, and then probably aerobic capacity as well, are your big non-negotiables when it comes to testing.
And I guess there's a balance of when you're collecting the data, it's making sure that you use it as well. So if you've got a big group, it's harder to do lots of different tests, and you might collect data for data's sake, really, which I see some coaches doing out there. It's actually making sure you're using the data and making it effective as possible into it.
Yeah, 100%. I think the integration of data is really important, not only for coaches, but also for the players. I think the players, from a perspective of education, I think it's really important that they are educated around why we do what we do, what test is looking at what, why it might relate to your sporting example. And then the other thing as well is having the communication with coaches around understanding if they're getting better. The big thing around testing is looking at the actionable short and long-term goals. I'm not expecting to see players make huge jumps, but over the steady years, I'd like to see improvements, because from a practitioner point of view, it means that we are potentially hitting the nail on the head when it comes to the development of athletic potential.
So let's talk about those big three
Yeah.
areas that you want to work on. What sort of testing what sort of tests do they look like for those three things?
So depending on the age, I think it's really important, and also the training age of an athlete, so how many years they've been in the gym competently training. So if we're looking at speed, I think the most important thing is maybe looking at their acceleration. So you're looking at 0 to 5, 0 to 10, and 0 to 30, and then looking at their top end speed potentially as well. So anything above 30 meters gives us an insight as well on their sort of like velocity curve. So are they more accelerated dominant, or are they more top speed dominant? From a power perspective, especially in cricket, we need that power. It's important to look at both, in my opinion, the horizontal and the vertical projection. So you're looking at anything like a counter movement jump, a squat jump, a broad jump, single leg hop, the differentiation of asymmetry between left and right leg. You could be looking at utilizing the stretch shortening cycle, stuff like drop jump, 10-5, those type of tests as well. The test for power is endless. You could go into upper body tests as well. And then strength, going back to that training age point I made briefly, I would never ever test 1RM with youth athletes. I don't think it's appropriate. 3RMs for athletes that have a higher training age of maybe 2 or 3 years plus potentially. But for me, in the non-evasive ways, I like either an isometric mid-thigh pull or an isometric squat. But it's important to note that those need really good bits of equipment that do cost a little bit of money. And if you don't have access to them, it can be quite difficult.
So I guess with like you mentioned around the equipment, that could be a barrier for some sports coaches, but you could still test strength, power and speed with practical equipment that you've got. So instead of using speed gates, for example, you could use a stopwatch. I know it's not gold standard, but it's still a measure of testing your athletes. Same with power. You could do horizontal. You can definitely test horizontal jump with a tape measure. You could do the vertical jump, where the classic one where you have some chalk in your hand and you have to touch it high as you can. These things aren't gold standard measures, but it still gives you some sort of an insight into your athlete's potential.
Yeah,
as
100%.
well.
I think you hit the nail on the head. The equipment can be a huge barrier. I think when you look at the process and systems of creating a battery of tests, the most important things to consider are the cleanliness of the data. So looking at the technique, you want variation to be as minimal as possible across the squad. So I see it time and time again with videos on Instagram and on Twitter, the discrepancies in technique across multiple athletes. And I would question whether that data is entirely applicable. Utilizing the hands in a vertical jump, so an arm swing, is far more beneficial for jump height than maybe hand on hips and taking that arm swing away. So if you are going to do tests are not gold standard in terms of force profiling with potential like force plates, etc., it's making sure that the technique is consistent across all the athletes. And then the other thing as well is it's got to be appropriate for what you're trying to do. I don't think that you said earlier, Isaac, about just testing for the sake of testing. I think, in my opinion, less is more. And then building on that, because ultimately I'm trying to answer an end goal in mind with what are we trying to do from a performance and coaching background? What are we trying to do in order to better these athletes? So yeah, it's a paradigm in itself.
And I like it you mentioned around the cleanliness of the data, and I see a lot of coaches putting that straight away come to the conclusion that they've got more power, they've got more speed from a 0.1 second change in their time, for example. But there's a lot of factors that maybe could come into the changing scores that you got to be aware of around the level that athlete comes in on that day, their motivation levels, what they've done prior, the actual testing itself. There's a lot of factors in there that could be influencing in changes in scores. So just being aware of when you're seeing changes in your testing to not ultimately jump to the conclusion they've got better in their certain physical quality that you're testing in.
Yeah, 100%. I think the biggest thing is making sure that technique is nailed. And that goes particular in probably the jumping and strength-based tests. Hence why I mentioned about the 1RM testing. I feel like when you get to that top end, 100, maybe 110% of what potential supramaximal might be, technique tends to be the breakdown. And I think that's where you risk injury, especially in the youth athlete population. If it's not done correctly with spotters, or if it's not done correctly within their age-related measurements of maturity, that there is a real interest in injury. And I think, it needs to be kept as simple as possible, in my opinion, with the action and outcome in mind. The outcome is essentially, what are we looking at from a long-term perspective? And then what actions are we going to take in the short, medium term to achieve those?
So you mentioned around the technique and the movement. Would you film as well, as long as collecting the number or the objective data with your profiling?
When you say film, are you referring to filming each athlete's technique?
Yeah, would you film, for example, someone's spin,
Yeah.
someone's running mechanics, or someone's jumping technique? Would you look at that as well alongside the objective measures?
Yeah, definitely. I think you have to make it realistic, as in, if you've got an athlete group of, say, 150 athletes in a school, I'm not going to be able to record every single one of those athletes running mechanics over 0 to 30 meters, because it would take me probably a few weeks to sift through all of them and provide actionable outcomes. If you're working on maybe a one-to-one aspect, so let's say you take a school scholar as an example, you might have more visual stimulus in terms of recording them, because you are working on a one-to-one capacity, and you can provide them that feedback almost instantaneously. But I'd like to think by then that if they are doing these tests, that they have some background of technical awareness of what they're trying to look for, and the difference between, let's say, a counter movement jump and a squat jump, as an example.
And you mentioned another barrier around with large groups and in your testing. So
Yeah.
have you got any tips around how you maybe structure a testing battery with a large group of, whether that's within your school or with this cricket setting that we're talking about here?
Yeah, so I think the school one in itself, some coaches really struggle to test large cohorts of athletes across a school term, whether that's because they've got extracurricular maths class, or they miss a session because they've got to go for a fixture, or so on or so forth. I think integrating it within the athletic development system is quite important. So as an example, testing them, let's say, weekly. So as an example, it might be like week 1, you might look at that growth and maturation. So as an example, athletes, when they come in, will need a weight and will need a height, and we'll record that data. That will take, for 150 athletes across a week, to get your weight and height, it'll probably take 20 seconds. And if you just have that in some area in the gym and a clipboard or an iPad that they can fill it in, great. Week 2, you might look at something like a broad jump, so looking at that horizontal power, and you might integrate that into the warm-up. So you might have a couple of tape measures on the floor, and you might say to the athlete, in your warm-up, we want 2 max effort broad jumps, stating the critical points around technique, stick landing, so on, and then asking them to record that. Week 3, you might look at something else. You might look at, let's say, speed, and that might be integrated pitch side in their skills rugby session, or in a longer duration type of training. Let's say that they've got an hour and a half training instead of maybe 45 minutes. And it's just making sure that you're there with an automated system. If you're using speed gates, great. If you've got a stopwatch, just making sure that you can record that data, whether it's on your mobile phone or on a clipboard. And then again, it's then transferring that back into something like maybe a dashboard that you've set up, or an Excel document that can just store that information for you, so it's safe. On the cricket perspective, we have more block testing. So it's done regularly every 3-4 months. They know exactly what the testing day holds, 2-3 hours of their time. We've got a battery of tests that are pre-selected. It's the same from 12 or 13 years old all the way up to 18. And that is integrated within their big one-day training blocks that they have in a February half term, or they might have in a pre-season session, maybe at the end of September, start of October time as well. So it varies depending on your accessibility to these athletes as well.
And I like the school element there you mentioned around the testing, because what I've had an experience in the past, especially working in cricket and youth athletes, is that fear of testing day.
Yeah,
Some athletes, you get the classic one that, oh, they're ill on testing day, or they pulled
yeah,
a muscle or whatever. But if you're integrating it into the warm up, then you're
yeah,
almost hiding that testing within the actual sports session, and you're
yeah.
making fun by putting it into the warm up. But I can see the side of, like, from a performance benefit in when you cricket stuff, where you need to be able to have those testing days as well, where you want to maybe look at more things. So it's the balance of getting the athletes buy-in into testing and making it practical for you as well.
1,000,000%. Absolutely 1,000,000%. And I think the language we use is really important. I don't think there needs to be a taboo around the testing or the use of testing as a word. I think the language and education is super important. So understanding from an athlete perspective why they might do what they do. The other one as well is reframing it. So instead of calling it testing, I read something the other day about calling it monitoring. And you change that use of language, and all of a sudden you lose the connotation around like testing and you call it monitoring. And all of a sudden athletes start to understand, okay, I'm monitoring my performance improvement as opposed to I'm testing. And it's just that choice of language. I think athletic development and essence is far more than just lifting weights and testing athletes. There's so much more around feedback and communication and language and co-coaching and all those aspects that we do in the day to day, but actually people probably don't understand as well.
I think one of the other myths around testing is that if you test it, people are going to be running shuttles, they're going to be pushed to their limits and stuff, which can put other people off around the testing. And I've changed my mind on when I would implement conditioning-based testing into youth athletes and what stage I may look at. What your thoughts are on where you maybe implement some sort of endurance-based testing into your youth athletes?
Again, education, I think, is really important. As an example, from the England Touch Association perspective that I have, it's from a point of our tournaments are maybe 3 or 4 days back to back, and having a good level of aerobic capacity is really important from a recovery point of view. Obviously, we know that the higher level of aerobic capacity you have, the quicker your recovery times tend to be from stuff like repeated sprints and high bouts of intensity. So it's telling the athlete that improving these scores will speed up your recovery, and thus you'll be far more positive and beneficial on maybe day 4, day 7 of a World Cup, because your recovery from day to day is important. And that goes back to the education around why we're doing what we're doing and what test is looking at what aspect. Because we don't just run in circles in sport. There's far more high intense bouts, quick, short, sharp cut, change of directions, accel, decels, jumping and landing in some other sports as well, that it becomes a governing factor around recovery is a big one that I talk about.
I think the key theme of this session today is education, relaying back to why the why of your testing and what it can
Yeah.
help in terms of their performance from the coaches, the parents, and the athletes, and because you've got a few different stakeholders in that youth athlete. So I imagine when you're feeding back the data to your athletes, that's where you're going to go down the lines of in terms of education and how it can relate to their performance and their development.
Yeah, totally. The conversations with parents and athletes is really important, and that's more around the soft skills of what we do as a coach, around that communication and language choices. And I think that many young coaches maybe struggle to have that because the experience and times that they face that might be minimal. How many times as a youth S&C coach might have you coached a CMJ? Probably quite a lot. But how many times have you had a conversation with a parent about why that CMJ score is good or bad, or why their son might be considered not for selection? And that in itself is really important. That goes back to the education, but it's more around the soft skills side of what we're doing and why we're doing it.
Yeah, there's soft skills around comparing athlete to athlete or comparing
Yeah,
individual to individual. It's around motivation and education, because if an athlete sees they've dropped off in 0.5 of a 30 centimeters in the CMJ or broad jump or whatever, and they see, oh, that's suddenly they've got worse in their scores, so it's getting to have an understanding of why that might be, or what little things maybe could contribute towards that. And also it's educating the coaches on their athletes and their scores. If they see an athlete getting slower, then they need to be educated on why that might be as well. So yeah, there's a lot to go on in terms of education, not just actually collecting the data.
Yeah, 100%. And I think talking from a speed perspective, that speeds tend to plateau during like mid-puberty, around that age of 13, 14, 15. So if we're testing speed, it's also being aware of the bigger picture, that you might think, oh, this athlete's slowing down, but actually the coordination element, because they're growing faster than their brain can keep up, that they're not slowing down, they're just going through that phase of circa puberty. And yeah, I think education is really important. And I think the tests that you pick need to be consistent. There's no point testing one thing for 6 months and then going, not really seeing an improvement here, and then going away from it for 2 or 3 years. I think if you can consistently do the right things and set attainable short and long-term goals, that these players will create a far bigger buy-in from their perspective, and they have a right to know what their scores are. And I think that's an important feat from a coaching perspective, that coaches need to know what the average normative data might be. Are they in and around average? Are they might be above average? Are they slightly below the average? And it's just knowing roughly where they should be within that cohort population, because there's no point testing a 14, 15-year-old athlete broad jump or vertical jump and then comparing it to an 18-year-old's. Just being aware of that.
And it's understanding that every person every 14-year-old, 15-year-old will develop at different rates.
Yeah.
Like some might go through their growth spurt really early, and then someone used a nice phrase the other day, when they mentioned they saw an athlete grow massively over a winter. It's like the Bambi on ice. So they're moving completely different from when they were in the past. So it's understanding that there are different factors that contribute towards the numbers.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the ability to look at movement as well, I think, is important. We've spoken about quite performance related tests like strength, power and speed, but also understanding their movement pattern as well. Are they able to do an overhead squat well to depth and create good extension overhead? Are they able to do a good knee to wall type test to show relevant ankle range of motion? These are all factors that are incorporated in testing that truthfully are the underpinning factors to be able to improve your strength, your power, because if you can't squat to depth, or if you can't get a good ankle range of motion in a split squat, then it's going to suffer in the long term. So that would be a really good starting point, is just understanding the movement pattern quality as well that we're looking for.
No, I appreciate that. And there's been some great insights in this chat, Isaac, and appreciate your time. I know we're running on time now, so with the difficulties as well. But have you got anything coming up, and is there any way that anyone can get in touch with you if you've got any questions following this chat?
Yeah, I would say I'm probably most active on Twitter. So my handle is Isaac Hopkins with an underscore. So Isaac_Hopkins. Again, reach out on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to have conversations with coaches, parents, etc., just for that education point of view. In terms of things coming up, we've got a World Cup for England Touch starting next month in Nottingham. So if you're around the Midlands area, it's based near the University of Nottingham, starting July 15th. So keep an eye out for that.
No, it sounds exciting, and good luck with that. And hopefully, is that every 4 years, that competition? So you've had a big build up for this competition as well.
Yeah, every 4 years. Obviously, it was hindered because of COVID, but yeah, every 4 years it's in Nottingham. Hopefully, a couple of medals would be quite nice. I'm intrigued to see some of these Southern Hemisphere teams, because they've got some real talent down in Australia and New Zealand.
No, that's exciting, and good luck with that. And hopefully, you do come back with a medal or two.
A couple would be really nice.
No, thank you, Isaac, for your time. Appreciate it. I know you're very busy, so thank you very much for coming to chat to us.
Yeah, no problem at all. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the Athletic Skills Podcast. I hope you enjoyed our discussion and found it helpful in learning more about impacting your youth athletes' movement and physical development. If you did enjoy this episode, please take a moment to give us a like, subscribe and share to any other coaches or teachers that you think it may help. Also, if you have any feedback or topics that you'd like us to cover in future episodes, please feel free to reach out to us on social media or on the email in the description, and we'll be more than happy to try and tackle those challenges you are facing as a sports coach or a PE teacher. Thank you very much, guys, for listening. I look forward to speaking to you soon.